Good morning and welcome to Rising. Ryan Grimm is back at the desk with us. Ryan, welcome. How was your vacation?
I couldn't be any more thrilled to be back here.
That's great to hear.
And I'm not lying at all. Not even a little bit.
Oh, I sense sarcasm. But we are glad that you're here because we have a great show ahead of us today. Ryan, who do we have?
Friends of the show, Nomiki Konst and Rachel Bovard, will join us to weigh in on the widening wealth disparities between the middle class and the 1%. Plus, Atlanta Journal reporter Greg Bluestein talks all Georgia politics. But first, the media is warning Americans to get a head start on holiday shopping amid fears of supply chain snarls. Halloween may seem extra spooky this year, according to the Wall Street Journal, citing shortages of Halloween decor and costumes. A Home Depot spokesperson says that stock on Halloween items went quickly as consumers are decorating again this year. And the popular Halloween pop-up chain Spirit Halloween said that while their selection was really good back in September, once October hit, it was gone.
Where are all those spectacular deals we're supposed to hear about? CNBC is suggesting holiday shoppers hit these stores now to grab their chosen items, pointing to the energy crises in mainland China and Europe, which are impacting shipping. We will all see higher prices on food, carbonated beverages, packaged food, and dry ice due to a CO2 shortage. And the cost of iPhones, electronics, and toys will also see a price tag increase amid a chip shortage and suspended operations at factories in China. Now, experts warn if you don't get your Christmas tree by the time the turkey is on the table, you may risk paying sky-high prices or not having anything at all. Cars and sportswear industries are also facing disruptions due to shutdowns in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Stephanie Kelton is here to join us. We really appreciate you breaking down some of these problems for us. Can you talk to us? Why are Americans suddenly seeing such, logistical problems? It seems to be that there's not an obvious. Maybe it's the pandemic, it's worker shortages, it's other things. Can you talk to us about what's going on?
Sure, and it is those things and other things. It's kind of all of the above. It is the lingering effects of the pandemic. It is bottlenecks in the supply chain. It is the fact that we are a globalized economy, that we began many, many years ago with production philosophy that the best thing to do was to increase efficiency, right? That everybody wanted to manufacture things on a just-in-time basis. And so we don't have a lot of spare capacity. We don't build up huge inventories. We don't leave a lot of slack in the system, and we spread out the supply chain in search of the lowest cost producer globally, and we concentrated production in key industries in key parts of the world. So if there are problems in South Korea and Taiwan with semiconductor production, you just don't have a fallback to get manufacturers to produce chips so that you can complete automobile production and so forth. So there's a lot going on.
And so, Stephanie, you're probably the public intellectual most closely associated with modern monetary theory, and for a very long time, whenever MMT discussed deficits, debt, and the limits thereof, the question came down to inflation. You would always say, look, everything is accounting until you get to a place where you're seeing prices rise, and then you have policy tools that you bring into place to deal with price stability. Here we are talking about inflation, but not debt-driven, not deficit-driven inflation. Price hikes driven by real shortages and supply chain problems. So how do MMT economists think about this question?
Yeah, well, so you're right. From the very beginning, MMT has centered inflation risk. That is the relevant risk, and we have focused on the productive capacity of the economy. And so the argument has always been, can the government afford to spend more on things like infrastructure, childcare, healthcare, education? Yes, there isn't a financial constraint, but there are limits and there are constraints, and we are witnessing those constraints play out across the world now. So it is very difficult to find people to do childcare today. It is difficult to hire drivers to move merchandise from port to retail factory. So there are constraints. There are real limits in our economy. Our productive capacity is under great strain, not just domestically, but globally. So what do you do about it? I mean, I think what people understand now is that the usual way of fighting inflation, which is to turn to the central bank and say, this is your job, you fix it. What is Jerome Powell? What is the Federal Reserve? What are other central banks supposed to do to deal with bottlenecks in the supply chain that are driving the cost of tennis shoes higher or semiconductor chips? The answer is not much. So what do? You deal with the constraints, with the bottlenecks, with the supply chain. So, a lot of the things that are in the president's Build Back Better agenda, while they won't do things immediately to alleviate all of the strains in the system, investing in infrastructure, dealing with the kinds of bottlenecks at the ports and roads and bridges and shipping. I mean, those are longer term, but even childcare, the investments in childcare will help alleviate some of the labor shortages.
Right. Some of these bottlenecks at ports, I mean, my understanding is many American ports, unlike ports elsewhere in the world, don't run 24 hours a day. They don't run on weekends or on Sundays. They're running under capacity, and so some companies are considering chartering private smaller vessels. They're going to look at smaller ports other than the main ones because of these issues. So those are worker issues, right?
Some of them are, but you also have, it's not just here in the U.S., though. I mean, you've got slowdowns in other parts of the world. You've got things backing up in China. And so we have a lot of problems that are fueling this inflationary pressure and these bottlenecks. And so to the extent that some companies have the balance sheets that allow them to go private and to do more to bring goods to consumers, they will do that. But, the big guys are eating up a lot of the space on the container ships, and that's making it very difficult for many smaller producers.
And I think you put your finger on a huge disconnect between the reality of the economy that we're currently living in and the conversation about that economy happening in Washington, particularly the conversation being led around by the nose by Joe Manchin, who has been saying we need to take a strategic pause on our investments through the reconciliation package or otherwise while we study the question of inflation. To Manchin, more government spending is going to mean more inflation. Therefore, we need to do less government spending and we'll have less inflation. Why is he wrong about that?
Yeah, so it sounds counterintuitive, right? If you think that you have an inflation problem on your hands and your instinct is to say, oh my God, spending more money will only make this problem worse. That sounds right, but in fact, it isn't correct. And counterintuitively, one of the ways to alleviate some of the inflationary pressures is, in fact, to spend more strategically on the kinds of things that will increase worker productivity, increase productive capacity, ease bottlenecks, and allow workers to transition back into the labor force to, mitigate some of the strain in terms of the labor shortage. And as I said, a lot of the things that the president wants to spend money on are productivity enhancing and capacity building, which, by the way, I'll just say very quickly, is why 17 Nobel Prize winning economists across the political spectrum recently attached their names to a letter giving their support to the president's agenda and making the case that it will, in fact, do the kinds of things I just talked about and alleviate inflationary pressure, some in the short term, some over the medium and longer term.
Stephanie, some experts are saying that high costs of transportation and a sudden jolt to supply chains are responsible for the mess, noting that while COVID accelerated the path to where we are now, supply chains were headed in this direction regardless. Here you can see how the Drewry World Container Index from Shanghai to Los Angeles appears to have shot up around July. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, I mean, some of this is just underinvestment. A lot of what happened early on in the pandemic is that many producers anticipated that things would get worse before they got better and that the recovery wouldn't come as quickly as it did. And so we drew down inventories. We didn't make, producers drew down inventories, didn't make the decision to continue to produce, to maintain capacity. And so some of what we're dealing with is just catch up. We had a quicker rebound than many anticipated. I mentioned earlier the shift to this just-in-time production. That's a much longer term decision that we're feeling play out. We are spread very thin. We don't have redundancies built into the system. We don't carry a lot of idle capacity. And so when there's a quick snapback in demand, supply is just having a lot of trouble catching up.
Some people are also bringing up the simple lack of labor required to fill large exchanges of goods. CEO Zach Cantor expressed that supply chain crisis may be rebranded to cover the fact that unions holding ports for ransom while ships backlog as workers only have 2 shifts. However, Saturday cargo pickups are rare. There's no work on Sundays, as I said earlier. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg was asked about the challenges of the supply chain, and here's what he had to say.
What is the risk that we will not have the goods on the shelves for Christmas?
Well, look, what we know is that there are short-term actions that we can take that are making a difference already. We just saw, for example, a considerable reduction in the dwell time on rail, the transfer to rail at those ports of LA and Long Beach. By the way, those 2 ports alone represent about 40% of our containerized traffic. Some of this is a bigger picture, longer-term issue that's going to take years and years to address. It goes to the very foundations of how our trade works. But what we're seeing is that piled up next to an issue created by the recovery from the pandemic. We have record traffic at some of these container ports.
But people don't want to hear that this is a problem we're going to be dealing with for years. They want to hear, how can we get back in shape for the coming holidays?
Yeah, I mean, look, people want to make money. Producers want to make money. Sellers, retailers want to make money. They want to get goods to consumers because that's how they get revenue and that's how they turn a profit. So if you believe that the profit motive itself is a sufficient driver, right, it will incentivize the quicker working out of some of these supply chain disruptions, then I think you can take a more optimistic kind of stance when it comes to just how long we're going to be dealing with this. But there's no question that the effects have lingered longer than many anticipated, that we're not through it yet. And they sort of pop up. You know, we had this debate about whether inflationary pressures were going to be transitory or persistent. But if you get a transitory impulse, something increases in price, you have problems and bottlenecks, you work that out, but then another one pops up. It feels like inflation isn't going away. It feels like the problem isn't going away. So I think that, you know, producers are catching up. We are likely to see maybe another 8, 12, maybe 15 months, who knows? I mean, we don't know how long it will take to fully work through the backlogs here, but I feel pretty confident that markets are going to catch up.
All right, and you alluded briefly to the energy crisis in both Europe and in China as playing a role here. What is going on there, and how is that filtering down?
Well, again, some of it is the quicker rebound in the economy, and producers. You've got a lot of things going on with natural gas shortages, and I know some people are trying to sort of blame the environmentalists and say this is really a result of a decision to turn our backs on fossil fuels and to try to plunge forward with renewables and things that we just don't have the capacity to do yet. But I really don't think that's what's going on. What you have in most cases, I think, are producers who just fell behind in terms of the supply capacity and the production. And largely it was about not anticipating the strength of the rebound. Yeah. And people are spending more, and we're just not quite there in terms of catching up.
Well, Stephanie Kelton, author of the great book, The Deficit Myth, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you both for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.